In the previous lesson, we spent some time talking about the social, cultural, and economic condition of the German Empire as it was established in 1871. This lesson is going to focus on the next part of the AQA specification, focusing on the government and opposition under Kaiser Wilhelm I, talking about the government under Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck. We'll talk about their respective personalities and policies, the role of the Reichstag, and the struggle between autocracy and democracy, before finally thinking about the development of parties and political opposition. The lesson itself will be divided into the following sections. These are what we will be talking about. Firstly, thinking about Kaiser Wilhelm I. Secondly, talking about Otto von Bismarck as Chancellor. And then thirdly, thinking about the Reichstag, autocracy and democracy, and then parties and political opposition. So, the government of the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm I and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck established a unique political structure that emphasizes autocracy while also trying to incorporate elements of a parliamentary system. And this kind of tussle, if you will, this kind of back and forth between autocracy and democracy would prove to be a particularly challenging aspect of the German Empire, going all the way up to and including the First World War. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm I was the first emperor of the German Empire, and he played largely a symbolic and a ceremonial role in this endeavour. However, he was nevertheless a respected authority figure who supported Bismarck's vision of a unified Germany. In terms of his personality and role, he was a traditionalist and a military man. He was conservative in his views, and he was deferential to Bismarck when it came to matters including of governance, and essentially trusting Bismarck to handle the complexities of political administration. He valued order and stability, which he believed Bismarck would best maintain. So, with this in mind, we can conclude that Wilhelm I generally avoided the direct involvement in the day-to-day affairs of government, preferring instead to allow Bismarck to manage the policy making and the day-to-day affairs of that particular role, the role of the Chancellor. This is the case even though he held significant constitutional powers. These included the authority to appoint and dismiss the Chancellor, and this was marked. His reign, Wilhelm I, was marked by his reliance on Bismarck's leadership, especially when it came to foreign policy and domestic governance. And so, when we think about this period of history, the most important element of it, in terms of our understanding of the political structure at the time, was, of course, Otto von Bismarck. Now, in terms of his personality, Otto von Bismarck is often referred to as the Iron Chancellor, known for his pragmatism, his shrewdness, and his fierce determination. He was a master strategist and a diplomat with an authoritarian style. He sought to maintain the German Empire's stability, and he did so by balancing quite carefully competing interests. His personality was forceful and often sometimes seen as autocratic, hence why we talk about this distinction between autocracy and democracy at this period of time. And he was willing to take aggressive steps in order to neutralize opposition and to secure his policies. In terms of his personality, i.e. his political ideology, despite having quite clear conservative leanings, as did everybody during this period of the German Empire, Bismarck would nevertheless be seen as a pragmatic individual, sometimes supporting limited social reforms in order to appease different political factions. In terms of his policies, then, from the perspective of foreign policy, Bismarck centered his foreign policy on the maintenance of peace in Europe and the avoidance of conflict which could threaten the newly unified Germany. This approach was very pragmatic and is sometimes known in the circles of international relations as realpolitik. He emphasized pragmatic alliances, including, for example, the League of the three emperors, which was with Austria-Hungary and Russia, and later the dual alliance with just Austria-Hungary. This was seeking to essentially isolate France and to try and maintain a balance of power within the German Empire, or specifically within Europe more generally, should I say. Domestically, then, Bismarck focused on consolidating imperial authority. He had aimed to unify the empire's quite diverse collection of states. We know from the previous video, for example, that the unification of Germany in 1871 was done with a quite significant amount of dominance from the perspective of Prussia. Using the powers granted by the 1871 Constitution, this would be being able to utilize the limitation of influence of the Reichstag in order to keep opposition in check. And so with this being implemented, there are a number of policies that we could think about. The first of which were sort of a collective series of policies known as Kultural Kampf, which were essentially aimed to reduce the influence of the church, specifically the Catholic Church in Germany. Bismarck saw the Catholic Church as a threat to state loyalty, and so the Kultural Kampf, again, I'm probably butchering that particular pronunciation. The Kultural Kampf primarily targeted the Centre Party, which we'll get to in a second, and also by extension of targeting the Centre Party, it targeted Catholics, given the fact that the Centre Party represented Catholic interests the most. Now, in terms of an assessment of this policy, it ultimately failed as it generated quite substantial opposition, and in fact actually led to the growth of the Centre Party rather than its decline. In terms of other political policies that were implemented at a domestic level, there were also a number of anti-socialist laws that were implemented. Bismarck viewed socialism and, by extension, the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, as a threat to the empire's stability, and so from 1878, anti-socialist laws were implemented. These laws restricted socialist publications, socialist meetings, socialist organizations. Though they could not eliminate socialism completely, which would continue to grow in popularity and among the working class, and would grow to even greater extents when we see the establishment of the KPD, the German Communist Party, following the end of the First World War, or at least the growth of the KPD after the First World War. In order to counter the appeal of socialism, Bismarck tried to introduce a number of social welfare policies. This was a sort of way to try and implement from the position of the empire, from the position of the state, a sense of socialist and social welfare political maneuverings, essentially. So these included the influence and the issuance, of health insurance in 1883, accident insurance in 1884, and old age pensions in 1889. And these were actually seen as some of the most radical first welfare programs of their time across any part of Europe, in fact. And they were designed to create loyalty to the state among workers and try to essentially neutralize the SDP. So he was a very shrewd political thinker. He would implement social welfare policies, but not necessarily for the sort of general good that a social welfare policy might bring, but more to try and neutralize and to isolate the political enemies of the empire, i.e. the SDP and the idea of socialism more broadly. During this period, the Reichstag was the lower house of the German Empire's parliament, and it had quite limited legislative powers, but was still nevertheless central to political debate and party activity. It was elected by male suffrage, which in theory represented a more democratic move in terms of representation. However, in practice, its actual influence over government policy was significantly restricted. So, powers and limitations: the Reichstag could discuss and vote on legislation and vote on and discuss the budget, but it could not initiate laws independently, as per the 1871 Constitution, nor could it control the Chancellor, who was answerable to only one individual. That individual was the Emperor. While Bismarck needed the Reichstag's support when it came to the passage of budgets, he often would bypass the Reichstag when it came to major policy decisions, instead relying on the powers of the Emperor and also the Federal Council, sometimes known as the Bundesrat. Bismarck was adept when it came to the management of the Reichstag, when it came to the political management of the Reichstag. He would often manipulate the political alliances of each individual member in order to push through his own personal agenda. He would form shifting coalitions with various parties as and when he needed to. This would include, for example, during the 1870s when he aligned more so with the National Liberals. This would essentially allow him to pursue economic policies, and then in the 1880s he would push more towards the Conservatives, in which he enacted more authoritarian measures. By keeping the Reichstag's influence relatively limited, Bismarck was able to prevent it from becoming a base of opposition to the imperial authority of him and Wilhelm I. We'll get to Weimar later. Weimar is not a person; it's a place and a constitution. So with all this being said, we've already really discussed this particular question throughout this lesson, but we'll just do it a little bit more here. This is the struggle and the sort of challenge and the sort of dialectic, if you will, between autocracy and democracy. The political system of the German Empire embodied a fundamental tension between these two aspirations. While, on the one hand, the Reichstag offered a forum for public representation and democracy, if you were male at least, real power still nevertheless remained concentrated in the hands of both the Emperor through Kaiser Wilhelm I and the Chancellor through Otto von Bismarck. This therefore reflected, in fact, an authoritarian system designed to limit the popular influence. So with this being said, the autocratic elements, of course, was the fact that the Constitution of 1871 placed ultimate authority with that of the Emperor. The Emperor would be the individual who was responsible for appointing the Chancellor and for controlling the military. And given the fact that the Chancellor, during this period, specifically Bismarck, had such a major role and influence within the politics of the Empire, the fact that the appointment of the Chancellor stemmed from the Emperor meant that the ultimate authority was in that of Kaiser Wilhelm I. Now, essentially, Bismarck's role as Chancellor allowed him to implement policies without the consent of the Reichstag when that was necessary. He was known to govern in a sort of quasi-authoritarian or quasi-autocratic style. He would often utilize, for example, the use of emergency decrees and the leveraging of alliances to bypass the democratic institutions that, for example, included the Reichstag. The elements and aspirations of democracy can be seen in the elected Reichstag itself. The Reichstag provided a voice for various different political and social groups, especially when it came to the fact that there was universal male suffrage. Now, you might think that this is a bit of a step backwards, but in 1871, universal male suffrage was particularly progressive. Obviously, it didn't include female suffrage, which was still a problem, but the fact that there was universal male suffrage is still quite a positive step forward, given the fact that in other countries, in other empires, the suffrage would be exclusively male, but often exclusively male and property owning, for example, which of course limited quite a significant number of people from voting. So the Reichstag did have this element of democracy. However, its lack of executive control and its complete dependence, should I say, on the Emperor and the Bundesrat undermined its democratic potential. And so political parties gained influence in the Reichstag, pushed for greater representation, but true democratic reforms would always be curtailed under the approach of Bismarck's autocratic elements. So, with this being said then, the German Empire's political party landscape during this time evolved as various groups would begin to organise and to express their interests in the Reichstag, creating quite a significant amount of political opposition and support for government. The first group, for example, included the National Liberals. These were a group of individuals, a political party that would be aligned with Bismarck during the early years of the empire and would represent the kind of business and middle class interests. And this generally meant that they supported economic modernization, limited constitutional reforms. However, their support waned as Bismarck adopted more conservative and anti-socialist policies in the 1880s, which we will get to. The Centre Party, the Zentrum, was a party which emerged as a defender of the Catholic interests, which of course came about under the policies of Bismarck of Kulturkampf, and it became a significant force in the Reichstag, advocating for local autonomy and religious freedom. The Centre Party exemplified the growing power of political opposition, forcing, in fact, Bismarck to make concessions to the Reichstag, to end the policy of Kulturkampf, and to essentially be able to have to make an alliance with and to make a deal with this central party. The SPD was the Social Democratic Party, representing the working class, advocating for social reforms, workers' rights, and democratic representations. Despite being targeted by Bismarck's anti-socialism laws, the SPD gained popularity, and this was because they symbolized the rising influence of socialist idealism, and its resilience demonstrated the limits of Bismarck's control and the persistence of democratic opposition. The final two parties, first of which were the Conservative Party and the Free Conservative Party, that I sort of linked them two together. They represented an aristocratic and agrarian interests of the highest classes within German society, especially those of the Prussian Junkers. They supported Bismarck's authoritarian policies and resisted democratic reforms, again closely aligning themselves with the autocratic elements and the autocratic interests of the empire. Finally, then, last but not least, is the DFP, the Progressive People's Parties. The DFP represented a more radical liberal wing, advocating again for greater parliamentary power and specifically advocating for civil liberties. Often in opposition to Bismarck, the progressives, the DFP, criticized the autocratic style and pressed for an increase in democracy. So these political parties also signified the struggle that is existing between autocracy and democracy, between the emperor, the Kaiser Wilhelm I, and his chancellor Otto von Bismarck on the one hand, and the political power and the politics of the Reichstag, the legislative branch, on the other. All of these things, therefore, show that the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm I and Bismarck was characterized by an autocratic system with very limited democratic representation. There was authoritarian governance and strategic alliances made by Bismarck, and it kept opposition contained, although he would still nevertheless introduce social policies, which we will get to in more detail, social policies, at the end of the day. The tensions between Bismarck's autocratic policies and the growing influence of political parties in the Reichstag would set the stage for future struggles that would begin to exist between the contrasting ideas of monarchy on the one hand and democracy on the other when it came to Germany, and would pave the way, with a little help from the First World War, for the abdication of the second Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the subject of which will be the topic of the next lesson.